The gunshot that shattered the midnight silence of Deadwood Crossing didn't just kill Marshal Tom Hendricks. It awakened every ghost that Eve Larue had spent 23 years trying to bury. She stood frozen behind the mahogany bar of the Larue Saloon, her father's battered photograph trembling in her hands, like a leaf in a hurricane. The silver frame, tarnished with age and worn smooth by countless nights of desperate polishing, reflected the amber glow of coal oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the saloon's weathered walls. She'd been cleaning the glass when the shot rang out, a ritual she performed every night at closing time. And now Thomas Larue's gentle brown eyes seemed to stare accusingly from behind the spiderweb of cracks that had appeared the moment the bullet found its mark. 23 years. 23 long, brutal years since Silver Creek, and the sound of sudden, violent death still transported her back to that burning hell where she'd watched her father die screaming her name. Through the saloon's dust-caked windows, warped with age and scarred by countless desert storms, she could see Marshal Hendricks sprawled face down in the rutted dirt of Main Street. His silver badge caught the pale moonlight like a fallen star, winking once before the growing pool of blood beneath his head dulled its shine forever. The lawman's right hand still clutched his service revolver, unfired, useless. He'd never even had the chance to draw it properly before death claimed him. Hendricks had been her last hope, and the only man in this godforsaken border town with the backbone to stand against what she'd known was coming. For 3 weeks, ever since she'd finally worked up the courage to send that coded telegram to the territorial marshal's office, she'd been waiting for this moment. The moment when her carefully constructed new life would come crashing down around her ears like a house of cards in a tornado. "Well now," drawled a voice from the shadows near the back corner booth, each word dripping with the kind of casual menace that made strong men soil themselves. "Seems our local law dogs learned some new tricks. Playing dead like that." Clay Durant emerged from the gloom like a mountain avalanche, given human form, his massive frame 6 feet 4 inches of pure malevolence. Wrapped in an expensive black coat, casting long, writhing shadows across the saloon's scarred plank floor. Behind him, arranged with the precision of a military formation, sat 11 men who represented the absolute worst the frontier had to offer. Each face bore the weathered stamp of professional violence, eyes that had seen too much death and hands that had dealt it out with casual efficiency. Their weapons lay on the tables before them, like offerings to some dark god of warfare. Colts and Remington shotguns and rifles, each one bearing the kind of notches that told stories no decent person would want to hear. But it was the 12th man who stopped Eve's heart cold and sent ice water flooding through her veins. He sat apart from the others at a small round table near the window that faced the cemetery on the hill. A delicate china teacup, incongruous as a flower in a graveyard. Balanced in hands that Eve knew could break a man's neck with the same casual ease most people used to swat flies. Tall and lean as a whip, with silver threading through his coal-black hair like veins of precious metal in dark stone, he possessed the kind of absolute stillness that came from perfect confidence in one's ability to deal death. When he looked up from his tea meeting, her gaze with eyes the color of winter storms, beautiful, merciless, and utterly devastatingly familiar, Eve felt the last 23 years of her carefully constructed life crumble like ancient parchment in a fire. Those were the eyes that had haunted her dreams since childhood. The last thing her father had seen before Clay Durant put a bullet in his brain and set fire to everything Thomas Larue had tried to build in the wilderness. Miss Evelyn Marie Larue. Durant said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake oil salesman who'd learned to mimic human emotion without ever truly feeling it. Each syllable was perfectly enunciated, cultured, the product of an education that made his chosen profession all the more terrifying. My. Look how you've grown up since Silver Creek. From a skinny little brat with pigtails and tear-stained cheeks to quite the handsome woman. Your dear departed daddy would be so proud. The words hit her like physical blows. each one calculated to strip away the armor of competence and strength she'd built around herself. Eve's hand moved instinctively toward the sawed-off shotgun mounted beneath the bar, a movement she'd practiced 10,000 times in the mirror until it was as natural as breathing. But 12 sets of predatory eyes tracked the gesture with the kind of interest a pack of wolves might show a wounded deer, and she forced herself to stillness. "I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else, mister." She managed her voice steady despite the terror that was turning her bones to water. "I don't know anything about any Silver Creek." Durant's laughter was like the sound of grinding millstones, harsh and relentless. "Oh, but I don't think so, my dear. You see, I never ever forget a face, especially not one that watched me work. 7 years old, you were hiding in that grain silo like a little mouse while your daddy Thomas begged for his worthless life. Such a sweet little thing with those blonde pigtails and those big blue eyes streaming with tears. You didn't make a sound, did you, smart girl? Knew that one peep would bring you the same fate as dear old Dad." Eve felt her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack like ice in spring thaw. For 3 years, she'd run the Larue Saloon with an iron fist and a reputation for brooking no nonsense from anyone. Cowboys twice her size had learned to mind their manners in her establishment, knowing she'd put bullets in bigger fools than them. Drifters and gunfighters, cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, they all treated her with a kind of wary respect, usually reserved for rattlesnakes and loaded cannons. But Clay Durant saw through it all, straight through to the terrified 7-year-old girl, still cowering in that grain silo watching her world burn. The question is... Durant continued settling his considerable bulk into a chair that groaned ominously under his weight. What does a little girl do when she grows up and discovers she's the only living witness to a massacre that certain people would prefer stayed buried? Does she keep her pretty mouth shut and mind her own business? Or does she start writing letters to territorial marshals and stirring up trouble that's been sleeping peacefully for more than 2 decades? The 12th man spoke for the first time, his voice like wind across winter graves, soft and deadly. "She learns to keep her mouth shut if she's smart." Durant's pale gray eyes narrowed to slits. Jonah Kane Ashford, the ghost of Silver Creek himself. Wondered when you'd grace us with your wisdom. Kane, the name that had haunted newspaper headlines and dime novels for a generation. The man who'd killed 17 innocent souls in a single night, and then vanished into the desert like smoke. Stories said he could draw faster than chain lightning, that he'd never missed a shot that mattered, that he could track a man across solid rock and kill him from a mile away with a rifle. But here he sat calmly sipping tea from a china cup, as if he were taking afternoon refreshment in a Boston drawing room rather than planning murder in a frontier saloon. Clay Kane acknowledged with a slight nod that somehow managed to convey both respect and contempt in a single gesture. "Still making friends wherever you go, I see." Friends. Durant's smile revealed teeth like yellowed tombstones, each one a monument to decades of violence and decay. "Oh, my dear Kane, we're well past friendship. This is about cleaning up old business, tying up loose ends, making sure certain stories never get told to the wrong people." He gestured toward the window, where Marshal Hendrick's body lay, cooling in the dust, already attracting the attention of the ravens that served as Deadwood Crossing's unofficial undertakers. The good marshal was asking too many questions, you see. Writing too many letters to the territorial capital. Had himself some very interesting correspondence with certain local citizens who should have known better than to go poking around in graves that are better left undisturbed. Eve's mind raced like a Mustang with its tail on fire. 3 weeks ago, she'd finally worked up the courage to send that coded message to the territorial marshal's office through Hendricks, using a cipher her father had taught her during their long evenings by the fire. The marshal had promised to investigate to bring justice for Thomas Larue and the 16 other souls who died at Silver Creek. He'd sworn on his mother's grave that he'd see Durant and his crew hang for their crimes. Now Hendricks was dead, and she was trapped in her own saloon with the monsters who destroyed her childhood and murdered her dreams. "What do you want from me?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Durant's smile widened like a crack in the earth before an earthquake. "Oh, my dear, sweet, naive little girl, this isn't about what I want. It's about what you've already done. You see, we intercepted some very interesting correspondence between you and certain territorial authorities. Very detailed information about Silver Creek, about my associates, about things that happened long ago and should have stayed buried." He reached into his vest with the deliberate care of a man handling dynamite and withdrew a folded telegram, spreading it on the bar with the reverence of a priest displaying Holy Scripture. It bore the official seal of the Territorial Marshal's office, and every word was a death sentence written in government ink. "Request immediate investigation, Silver Creek Massacre, 1851. Durant read aloud, his cultured voice turning each word into a weapon. Multiple witnesses confirm Clay Durant and associates responsible 17 deaths, including Thomas Larue, mining engineer. Evidence suggests ongoing criminal enterprise. Request federal intervention. Signed, Evelyn Marie Larue, proprietor, Larue Saloon, Deadwood Crossing." Eve's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She'd been so careful, so secretive about her correspondence. She'd used her maiden name, coded her messages, even had Hendricks send them through different routes to throw off potential interception. How in God's name had Durant gotten his hands on official territorial correspondence? Deputy Foster's been quite helpful in keeping us informed about local law enforcement activities. Durant explained, as if reading the questions written across her face. Amazing what a little gold can buy these days. Loyalty information, even access to a federal marshal's private correspondence. The boy's got expensive tastes and flexible morals, a combination I've always found useful in my business associates. Quinn Foster, the nervous, eager deputy, who'd always seemed slightly out of place in Deadwood Crossing's brutal frontier environment. Red-haired and freckled with the kind of boyish face that made people want to trust him, he'd been Durant's inside man all along. The reason the gang always stayed one step ahead of the law, the reason Pazez never seemed to catch them, and the reason witnesses had a habit of dying in unfortunate accidents before they could testify. "You're lying," Eve whispered. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were false. Too many things made sense now. Foster's unexpected appearances at the saloon, his probing questions about strangers in town, his nervous energy whenever anyone mentioned the territorial marshals. "Am I?" Durant's voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd built his empire on information and betrayal. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" The saloon's batwing doors burst open with a crash that made the windows rattle in their frames, admitting Deputy Foster along with a gust of desert wind that set the lanterns swaying like hanged men. His badge caught the lamplight as he approached, but his nervous energy and the eager gleam in his pale blue eyes suggested a man reporting to his real master rather than investigating a disturbance. "It's done," Foster said, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Hendricks won't be writing any more letters to anyone. Doc Morrison's next on the list. He's at the widow Patterson's place right now, tending to her rheumatism. After that old Samuel at the telegraph office, then we can wrap this whole business up neat and tidy." Eve's world tilted on its axis like a ship in a hurricane. The 4 names Foster had mentioned were the only people in Deadwood Crossing who knew about her correspondence with the territorial authorities. Without them, she was alone with her secrets, and her guilt surrounded by the very men who'd created both. "Please," she began. But Durant cut her off with a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and utterly final. "Oh, there's no need to beg, my dear. I'm not an unreasonable man, ask any of my associates. In fact, I'm prepared to offer you a choice which is more consideration than your father received, if memory serves." He leaned forward, his considerable bulk making the bar creak ominously under the pressure. His breath smelled of whiskey and decay, the exhalation of a man who'd spent decades consuming other people's lives. You can come with us quietly, help us clean up this unfortunate mess, and maybe you'll live to see another sunrise. Or you can make this difficult for everyone involved, and then we'll burn this place down around you like we did your daddy's farm." Eve's hand tightened on her father's photograph until her knuckles went white. Thomas Larue had been a gentleman, a dreamer who'd believed the frontier could be tamed with hard work, honest dealing, and faith in human decency. He'd been an engineer by training, a scholar by inclination, and a father by choice. Hardly the kind of man equipped to deal with the kind of evil that Clay Durant represented. He'd died because he'd witnessed something unforgivable and couldn't live with staying silent about it. Now his daughter faced the same impossible choice. "I need time to think," she said, buying precious seconds to consider her options. Durant's laughter boomed across the saloon like thunder before a storm. "Time. Oh, my dear, sweet, innocent little girl, time is the one thing you don't have. You see there's a storm coming, can't you feel it in the air? Big one, too, the kind that washes away everything in its path. Buildings, people, evidence, memories, all of it gone like it never existed." As if summoned by his words, thunder rumbled in the distance like the footsteps of angry gods. Through the windows, Eve could see lightning flickering on the horizon, promising the kind of desert storm that could level buildings and bury secrets under tons of sand and debris. The air itself seemed to thicken with electricity and menace pressing down on the saloon like the weight of impending doom. 1 hour. Durant said, consulting a gold pocket watch that had probably been stolen from one of his victims. "Then we collect what we came for and ride out ahead of the storm. Whether you're breathing when we leave this place, well, that's entirely up to you and the choices you make in the next 60 minutes. Kane had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now he set down his teacup with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that the smallest actions could have the largest consequences. "Might I suggest a different approach, Clay?" Durant's eyes narrowed like a snake preparing to strike. "Such as, the girl's not our enemy. She's just scared. Traumatized. Been carrying the weight of what she saw for 23 years like a stone in her chest." Kane's voice carried an odd note of compassion that seemed utterly at odds with his reputation as a cold-blooded killer. "Maybe it's time to put the past to rest, all of it. Forever. You getting soft in your old age, Kane." Durant's voice held a warning that would have sent lesser men running for the hills. Starting to grow a conscience after all these years. Kane's smile was winter cold and twice as deadly. "Just thinking strategically, old friend. Dead martyrs have a way of inspiring more questions than live cowards. Kill the girl and someone else will take up her cause. Let her live and she becomes just another frontier woman trying to scratch out a living in a hard land." Eve studied the exchange between these two legends of violence, with growing confusion and a tiny spark of hope. There was history between them, layers of meaning, and shared experience that she couldn't begin to decode. But she sensed an opportunity in their tension, a crack in Durant's armor, that she might be able to exploit if she was clever enough and brave enough. "What happened to your family?" She asked Kane suddenly, the question emerging from some deep well of desperate intuition. The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between dueling gunfighters. Kane's composure cracked for just an instant, revealing depths of pain and guilt that made her own losses seem shallow by comparison. His pale eyes went distant, seeing something beyond the saloon walls, beyond the present moment, beyond the reach of forgiveness. "Careful, girl." Durant warned, but his voice carried a note of genuine concern for the first time since entering the saloon. "That's not a wound you want to poke with a stick." But Kane was already speaking, his voice barely audible above the rising wind outside. "House fire. 2 years after Silver Creek. My wife Sarah, my boy Tommy. 5 years old, he was with his mother's green eyes and his daddy's stubborn streak. They burned alive while I was off playing outlaw with this piece of human garbage." The words hit Durant like physical blows. And for the first time, Eve saw genuine emotion flicker across the gang leader's weathered features. Not remorse, she doubted he was capable of that, but something that might have been regret if it had been felt by a better man. Now that's not fair, Kane. Durant said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. You knew the risks when you signed on with us. We all did. It's a dangerous business we're in. I knew the risks to myself. Kane corrected his voice, gaining strength and fury with each word. I didn't know you'd murder innocent women and children to cover your tracks. I didn't know you'd burn down farmhouses with families sleeping inside just to make sure there were no witnesses to your cowardice. The saloon fell silent except for the wind howling outside like the voices of the damned. Eve realized she was witnessing something rare and terrible. A confrontation between legends, a settling of accounts that had been 20 years in the making. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the very molecules were holding their breath. You think I don't know why you're really here? Durant continued, his voice regaining some of its usual menace. You think I don't see the hunger in your eyes, the way your hand keeps drifting toward that gun? You've been planning this moment for years, haven't you? Waiting for the right opportunity to put a bullet in me and call it justice. Kane's hand moved fractionally closer to the worn grip of his Colt. The thought had occurred to me. Well, here's your chance, old friend. Durant spread his arms wide, presenting himself as a target with the kind of theatrical flourish that had made him famous across the territory. Draw on me, Kane. Show everyone what the ghost of Silver Creek is really made of. Let's see if you're still the fastest gun west of the Mississippi. Eve watched this deadly dance with growing horror. She was trapped between two forces of nature, both of them perfectly willing to kill her to settle their personal grudge. But as she studied Kane's weathered face, she saw something unexpected lurking beneath the surface: genuine remorse, the kind of soul-deep guilt that came from carrying the weight of unforgivable acts. You want to know what really happened at Silver Creek? Kane asked quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. You want to know the real reason I'm here? Durant's confident smile faltered slightly. I know what happened. We robbed a mining camp, eliminated the witnesses, and rode away richer than kings. End of story. That's what you told everyone else. Kane agreed, his pale eyes never leaving Durant's face. But that's not the whole truth, is it? That's not the story you tell yourself when you wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Kane rose from his chair with fluid grace, his hand still hovering near his weapon. The truth is, there was no silver at Silver Creek. Never had been. The whole strike was a myth, a story told by confidence men and dreamers to draw settlers to worthless land. Durant's face went pale beneath his weathered tan. You're lying. Tell me, Clay, what did we actually steal that night? What was our great prize for murdering 17 innocent people? What treasure justified burning children alive in their beds? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Eve could see the calculation in Durant's eyes, the growing realization that something fundamental had gone wrong with his carefully constructed narrative of that terrible night. $47.63. Kane continued relentlessly, each word falling like hammer blows on an anvil. That's what we found in the entire camp. $47.63, plus the broken dreams of families who'd bet everything on a lie. We killed 17 people for less money than a cowboy makes in a month, and you've been telling yourself it was justified ever since. But the silver, the reports, the assay office, all lies, all fiction, stories told by con men and fools. Kane's smile was terrible to behold, like the grin of a skull. We murdered a camp full of innocents for pocket change and the right to call ourselves the most feared gang in the territory. How does that feel, Clay? How does it feel to know that your legend is built on the bones of paupers and dreamers? Eve felt the world shifting beneath her feet like sand in an earthquake. Her father hadn't died protecting a fortune in precious metal. He'd died for $47.63 murdered by men who'd convinced themselves that killing was a profession worthy of respect. "You're wrong," Durant snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "You have to be wrong. The silver was real. The reports were real. The money we've made over the years came from robbing stagecoaches and rustling cattle." Kane finished. "You've been living off your reputation for 2 decades, trading on the fear of what people thought you'd done rather than what you actually accomplished. You're not a criminal mastermind, Clay. You're just a murderer who got lucky." The storm chose that moment to arrive. In full fury, wind howling around the saloon like the voices of the 17 souls who died at Silver Creek. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the confrontation in stark black and white, and thunder crashed overhead like the footsteps of approaching judgment. Durant's hand moved toward his gun with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who'd finally been pushed beyond his breaking point. "You always were too clever for your own good, Kane. That's what got your family killed in the first place." "No," Kane said quietly, his own hand now resting on his gun butt. "You got them killed. Just like you killed Thomas Larue and 16 other innocent people. Just like you're planning to kill his daughter." Eve's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird as she realized what was about to happen. These 2 men were about to paint her saloon with blood, and she was trapped in the middle of their decades-old war. The smart thing would be to dive for cover and let them kill each other. But something deep in her gut told her that neither man would be satisfied with just killing his enemy. The survivor would come for her next. That's when she made her choice. Instead of cowering behind the bar like the terrified child she'd once been, Eve stepped forward into the lamplight, her father's photograph clutched in her hand like a talisman. "I know who you are," she said to Kane, her voice cutting through the tension like a church bell at midnight. "I saw you that night at Silver Creek. You tried to stop him." Kane's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "You remember?" "I remember everything." Eve continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The way you argued with Durant before he shot my father. The way you tried to put out the fires after they started. The way you looked when you realized what you'd become part of. You didn't want to kill anyone that night, did you?" Durant's laughter was ugly desperate. "Touching, very touching. A regular family reunion. But it doesn't change anything, does it? You're still a witness, and witnesses are bad for business. They have a tendency to develop inconvenient memories at the worst possible times." Eve smiled, and for the first time in 23 years, it was completely genuine. "Oh, but I'm not just a witness anymore, am I? I'm something much more dangerous than that." She reached beneath the bar and withdrew a stack of papers, copies of telegrams, witness statements, sworn affidavits, all tied together with a red ribbon like a bouquet of legal dynamite. "I'm a storyteller, and I've been telling your story to everyone who matters for the past 6 months." Durant's face went white as bleached bone. "Impossible. Foster destroyed your correspondence, every piece of it. Foster destroyed the correspondence he knew about." Eve replied, her voice steady as granite. "But you see, I've been planning this for years, ever since I realized who really killed my father. Every detail, every crime, every victim, it's all documented and distributed to territorial authorities, federal marshals, even newspaper editors as far away as San Francisco and New York. The Denver Post is running the story next week. The Silver Creek Massacre, a survivor's account." The revelation hit Durant like a physical blow. His empire of fear and violence, built on secrecy and intimidation, was crumbling before his eyes. Exposed to the light of law and justice, his carefully constructed legend would collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. "You clever little bitch." He snarled, his cultured facade finally cracking to reveal the animal beneath. I learned from the best, Eve replied. My father always said the truth was the only weapon that really mattered. Took me 23 years to understand what he meant, but I finally got the lesson. Kane's smile was genuine for the first time since entering the saloon. Thomas Larue would be proud of his little girl. Proud. Durant's voice cracked with rage and desperation. She's destroyed everything, 20 years of work gone, 20 years of building something that mattered. You built nothing. Kane said quietly. You destroyed everything you touched and called it success. You murdered 17 innocent people for pocket change and convinced yourself you were a genius. You're not a criminal mastermind, Clay. You're just a killer who got lucky and stayed lucky longer than you deserved. Durant's response was to lunge for his gun, but Kane was faster. The former outlaw's Colt appeared in his hand, with liquid grace, the weapon seeming to flow from holster to firing position, like water finding its level. His first shot took Durant in the shoulder, spinning the gang leader around and sending him crashing into the wall behind him. The saloon erupted into chaos as the remaining outlaws scrambled for cover, their discipline crumbling in the face of unexpected betrayal. Eve ducked behind the bar as bullets shattered bottles above her head, the air filling with the sharp scent of spilled whiskey and gun smoke. She grabbed her hidden shotgun from its mount beneath the cash register, the familiar weight of the weapon steadying her nerves. Foster appeared at the end of the bar like a red-haired demon, his service revolver aimed at her head with the kind of steadiness that came from years of practice. Drop the gun, Miss Larue. This doesn't have to end badly for you, doesn't it? Eve kept the shotgun trained on his chest, her finger tightening on the trigger. You've been planning to kill me from the moment you walked in here. The only question is whether you'll do it quickly or take your time. Foster's nervous laugh grated like fingernails on slate. That was business, darling. This is personal. You've cost me everything, my position, my reputation, my future with Mr. Durant's organization. The least you can do is die quietly and let me salvage what I can from this mess. I've got a better idea, Eve said and pulled the trigger. The shotgun's boom echoed through the saloon like the voice of God's own judgment. Foster flew backward as if jerked by invisible strings, his chest opened like a flower of blood and bone. He hit the floor hard, his service revolver skittering away into the shadows, and lay still with his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Kane had taken cover behind an overturned table, his Colt speaking with mechanical precision. Two more outlaws lay motionless among the broken glass and spilled liquor, their dreams of easy money bleeding out onto the sawdust-covered floor. But Durant was still alive, still dangerous barking orders from behind the bar where he'd taken refuge. Kill them both. The gang leader roared, his voice hoarse with pain and fury. Burn this place down around them. I want their ashes scattered to the four winds. A bottle filled with coal oil sailed through the air, trailing a burning rag like a comet's tail. It shattered against the far wall in a burst of orange flame that immediately began licking at the dry wood of the saloon's interior. Another followed, then another, until the entire back wall was ablaze. We need to move, Kane shouted over the gunfire and the crackling of flames. This place is becoming a death trap. Eve grabbed her father's photograph and what cash she could reach from the register, then followed Kane toward the back exit. Behind them, the Larue saloon, her home, her sanctuary, her carefully constructed new life, dissolved into flame and chaos. They burst through the rear door into the full fury of the desert storm wind and sand whipping around them like the anger of ancient gods. The storm was everything Durant had promised, and more a wall of dust and lightning that turned the world into a howling maze of confusion and terror. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind was strong enough to knock a man off his feet if he wasn't careful. This way. Kane grabbed her hand, his grip strong and sure despite the chaos surrounding them. He pulled her toward the rocky trail that led up Cemetery Hill, where Deadwood Crossing's boot hill waited among the wind-twisted trees. High ground. We can make a stand there. We'll be trapped. Eve had to shout to be heard over the storm's fury. Better trapped with good cover than caught in the open. Kane's voice carried the authority of a man who'd survived similar battles before. Trust me. Eve had no choice but to follow him up the steep rocky path, her father's photograph clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were already beginning. Durant's surviving men regrouping, following their trail through the storm with the persistence of bloodhounds. The cemetery atop Cemetery Hill had been Deadwood Crossing's final resting place for 30 years. Populated by miners who died in cave-ins, cowboys who died in gunfights, and settlers who died from the simple act of trying to survive in an unforgiving land. Weathered headstones jutted from the rocky ground, like broken teeth, their inscriptions worn smooth by decades of wind and weather. Some bore names and dates, others simply said unknown or stranger monuments to people who died far from home and family. Kane positioned Eve behind a substantial marble monument, some cattle baron's final attempt at immortality, while he took cover behind a cluster of wooden crosses that marked the graves of Mexican vaqueros who died in a range war 15 years earlier. The storm provided additional concealment, the driving sand reducing visibility to mere yards and making accurate shooting nearly impossible. How many rounds you got left? Kane asked, checking his own ammunition with the methodical care of a professional. Eve opened the shotgun's breech, counting shells with fingers that trembled only slightly. 4 shots in the gun, 6 more in my pocket. You... Kane's smile held no humor. Enough to make this interesting. The first attack came 20 minutes later, coordinated, despite the chaos of the storm. 3 men approached from the south, using the larger headstones for cover, while 2 more tried to flank them from the east. These weren't common bandits. They were professionals, disciplined veterans, who knew how to work together under the worst possible conditions. Kane's rifle cracked first, and the shot carefully aimed despite the wind and driving sand. One of the flanking men spun away from cover, clutching his shoulder and screaming curses that would have made a sailor blush. He tried to return fire, but Kane had already shifted position, ghosting between the graves like the phantom his reputation claimed he was. Eve held her fire, waiting for a clear target while her heart hammered against her ribs like a drumbeat. This wasn't like shooting Foster in the heat of panic. This was calculated, killing cold and necessary, and she needed to make every shot count. A muzzle flash erupted from behind a stone angel whose wings had been broken by decades of weather, the bullet chipping granite inches from her head. Eve returned fire instinctively, her shotgun's boom lost in the storm's howl. The shooter cursed and ducked back into cover, but not before she caught a glimpse of his face, Charlie Briggs, one of Durant's most trusted lieutenants. 2 down. Kane called out, working the action of his rifle with mechanical precision. But they're getting closer. The remaining attackers pressed forward with professional discipline, using the storm and the irregular terrain to mask their approach. They moved by bounds, one group providing covering fire, while another advanced to better positions. It was textbook military tactics, the kind of coordinated assault that suggested these men had learned their trade in the war between the states. Eve found herself thinking about her father, wondering if he'd felt this same mixture of terror and determination in his final moments. Thomas Larue had been a gentle man, an engineer, and a dreamer, hardly equipped for the kind of violence that had ultimately claimed his life. But he'd tried to do the right thing, tried to stand up for what was decent and good in a world that seemed determined to reward the opposite. Now his daughter was following in his footsteps, and she could only pray she'd prove more capable of surviving the consequences. A bullet whined past her ear close enough to feel its wind, and Eve rolled left behind a weathered cross marked "Unknown Soldier." The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was fighting her own war among the graves of forgotten warriors, all of them united in death by the simple act of standing up for what they believed in. Kane had moved to a new position behind a family mausoleum, its stone walls pocked with bullet holes from previous gunfights. His rifle spoke with deadly accuracy, and another of Durant's men went down clutching his leg and screaming for help that wouldn't come. But the others kept advancing professional enough to know that their only chance lay in maintaining pressure until their targets ran out of ammunition. Eve, Kane's voice carried over the gunfire. "They're trying to get behind you." She turned to see a shadowy figure working his way among the headstones, using the storm for concealment. This one was smart, patient, taking his time to line up a killing shot. Eve tracked him with her shotgun, waiting for him to expose himself enough to make the shot count. When he finally made his move, rising from behind a crumbling monument with his rifle aimed at Kane's position, Eve was ready. Her shotgun boomed, and the man tumbled backward among the graves where he belonged. But the shot revealed her position, and immediately bullets began chipping stone around her hiding place. The battle's tide was turning against them. Durant's men were disciplined professionals with military training, while Kane and Eve were desperate amateurs fighting for their lives. They had better cover and the advantage of defense, but they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. That's when the first twist came. Charlie Briggs stepped into the clearing between the monuments. But instead of advancing on Kane and Eve, he turned his rifle on his own companions. The scarred veteran's weathered face was set with grim determination as he called out over the storm's fury. "That's far enough, boys. Time to end this madness." The other outlaws froze their weapons, half raised in confusion. "Charlie, what the hell are you doing?" "What I should have done 23 years ago at Silver Creek." Briggs replied, his voice carrying over the wind. "Standing up to a murderer and a coward. Taking a stand when it matters." Durant's voice boomed from the cemetery's entrance, where he'd taken position with his remaining men. Blood soaked his shirt from Kane's bullet, but he was still upright, still dangerous. "Charlie, you've lost your goddamn mind." "Have I?" Briggs kept his rifle trained on his former companions, his scarred hands steady despite the storm. "Or maybe I've finally found it after all these years. You killed my brother that night, Clay. Shot him down in cold blood when he tried to tell you to stop what tried to make you see reason. I've been waiting 23 years for the right moment to return the favor." The revelation hit Durant like a physical blow. Tommy Briggs, the young cowboy who tried to desert during the Silver Creek massacre, who'd drawn on Durant to stop the killing. Clay had gunned him down without hesitation, and Charlie had watched his baby brother die in the dirt. "You're all insane." Durant snarled, his cultured facade finally cracking completely. "After everything we've built together, after all the money we've made, all the territory we've claimed." "Built." Kane's voice carried 20 years of accumulated guilt and self-loathing. "You mean destroyed? We've spent 2 decades destroying everything we touched, leaving a trail of bodies and broken dreams across the territory. That's not building, Clay. That's butchery. Well, that's the nature of the business." Durant screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "No," Eve said, stepping out from behind her cover with her father's photograph clutched in her hand. "That's the nature of monsters. This is my father, Thomas Larue. He was a good man, a dreamer who believed the frontier could be tamed with hard work and honest intentions. You killed him for $47.63. You destroyed 17 families for pocket change." Durant's face twisted with rage and something that might have been shame if he'd been capable of feeling it. "Sentimental nonsense. The strong take what they want, the weak get trampled. That's the law of the frontier." "That's your law." Eve corrected, her voice steady despite the wind and chaos around her. "But it ends tonight." Durant's response was to draw his gun, the massive Colt appearing in his hand with surprising speed for a wounded man. But age and blood loss had slowed him, and Kane was faster. Much faster. The 2 shots came almost simultaneously, their echoes rolling across the cemetery like the voices of judgment itself. Durant's bullet went wide, chipping stone from a nearby headstone. Kane's shot took the gang leader's center mass, punching through his chest and dropping him among the graves where he belonged. Clay Durant fell backward, his blood mixing with the storm-blown dust to create a muddy paste beneath his body. He tried to speak, but only crimson foam emerged from his lips. The man who terrorized the territory for 20 years died with his eyes open, staring at the storm-torn sky, as if seeing something beyond mortal comprehension. But the battle wasn't over. The remaining members of Durant's crew demoralized by their leader's death, and Briggs's betrayal began to scatter into the storm. Some tried to surrender, others attempted to flee, but Kane's rifle spoke with methodical precision, cutting them down before they could escape to spread word of what had happened here. Eve watched this methodical execution with mixed feelings. These men were killers and worse deserving of whatever justice Kane dealt out. But there was something chilling about the former outlaw's efficiency, the cold calculation with which he eliminated potential threats. When the shooting stopped, that only Briggs remained alive among Durant's former crew. The scarred veteran lowered his rifle, his face reflecting a mixture of relief and profound sadness. "It's over," he said quietly, his words barely audible above the storm. Finally over. Kane struggled to his feet, blood seeping from wounds in his shoulder and side. Eve moved to support him, her own hands shaking from the aftermath of violence. The cost of justice had been high paid in blood and trauma that would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. "What happens now?" she asked. Kane's smile was tired but genuine. "Now we rebuild. Start over. Try to find something worth living for in all this mess." But before either of them could say more, a new voice cut through the storm, cultured, confident, and utterly unexpected. "I'm afraid that's not going to be possible." They turned to see a man emerging from the storm, his expensive suit somehow unmarked by the wind and dust. Middle-aged and distinguished with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, he carried himself with the kind of authority that came from real power rather than mere violence. "Who the hell are you?" Kane demanded, his rifle swinging to cover the newcomer. The man smiled, revealing perfect teeth. "Judge Harrison, Blackwood Territorial Circuit Court. I've been tracking Mr. Durant's activities for some time now, waiting for the right moment to bring him to justice." Eve felt her heart sink. After everything they'd been through, after all the blood and sacrifice, the law had finally arrived, too late to help, but just in time to complicate everything. "You're under arrest." Blackwood continued, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "All of you. For murder, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit various felonies." "These men were killers," Eve protested. "They murdered 17 people at Silver Creek, including my father. They came here to kill me and anyone else who could testify against them." "That may be true," Blackwood acknowledged. "But you took the law into your own hands, rather than allowing proper legal proceedings to take their course. That makes you criminals, regardless of your motivations." Kane's laugh was bitter as desert wind. "Legal proceedings? Where were your legal proceedings 23 years ago when Durant was butchering innocents? Where was the law when that little girl needed protection? The law doesn't always act as quickly as we might wish." Blackwood replied smoothly. "But it always acts eventually. Justice may be delayed, but it is never denied." "Justice." Eve's voice cracked with exhaustion and disbelief. "You call this justice arresting the victims while the real criminals lie dead in the dirt?" Blackwood's expression didn't change. "I call it the rule of law, Miss Larue. Without it, we're no better than the animals we're trying to civilize." That's when the second greater twist revealed itself. Charlie Briggs stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. "Judge, before you make any arrests, there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything about this situation." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "And what might that be, Mr. Briggs?" "These two didn't kill Clay Durant and his crew," Briggs said quietly. "I did." The words hung in the storm-torn air, like a challenge to reality itself. Eve stared at the scarred veteran in shock, while Kane's eyes narrowed with suspicion and growing understanding. "Charlie," Kane said quietly, "what are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago," Briggs replied, "taking responsibility for my choices." He turned to face Judge Blackwood directly. "I've been working with the Territorial Marshal's Office for the past 6 months, Your Honor. Undercover, gathering evidence on Durant's organization, building a case that would stand up in court." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, its contents protected from the storm by oiled cloth. Complete records of every crime, every victim, every dollar stolen over the past 20 years. Names, dates, locations, everything you need to close the books on the most successful criminal enterprise in territorial history. Blackwood examined the documents with growing amazement. "This is comprehensive, extraordinarily detailed. But it doesn't explain what happened here tonight." "Tonight was supposed to be a simple arrest," Briggs continued. "I'd arranged for federal marshals to be waiting when Durant arrived, ready to take him and his crew into custody. But something went wrong. The marshals never showed, and Durant realized he'd been betrayed." He gestured toward the bodies scattered among the graves. "What you see here is the result of an undercover operation gone bad. These men died resisting arrest, killed in the line of duty by a federal agent acting within his authority." Eve felt her jaw drop. The story was completely fabricated, a lie so audacious and comprehensive that it took her breath away. But as she looked at Briggs's weathered face, she saw something that made her reconsider not deception, but desperation. The desperate hope of a man trying to make amends for 23 years of complicity in murder. "You can verify my credentials with the Territorial Marshal's Office," Briggs continued. "Badge number 1847, appointed 6 months ago under direct authority of Governor Morrison himself." Judge Blackwood studied the documents with the careful attention of a man whose career depended on getting details right. After several long minutes, he looked up with an expression of grudging respect. "And this appears to be in order," he said finally. "Though I must say, Agent Briggs, your methods are somewhat unorthodox." "The situation called for extreme measures," Briggs replied. "Durant was planning to eliminate key witnesses and disappear into Mexico. This was our last chance to bring him to justice." Kane caught Eve's eye, and she saw her own amazement reflected in his pale gaze. Briggs was giving them a way out, a chance to walk away from this nightmare without facing murder charges. All they had to do was play along with his story and let him take responsibility for everything that had happened. But there was a cost. If Briggs claimed to be a federal agent, he'd have to face official scrutiny investigations and questions that might expose the truth. He was sacrificing his own future to protect theirs. "What about Miss Larue and Mr. Ashford?" Judge Blackwood asked. "What was their role in this operation?" "Civilian witnesses," Briggs said without hesitation. "Miss Larue had been cooperating with our investigation, providing information about Durant's activities in Deadwood Crossing. Mr. Ashford—" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Mr. Ashford is a reformed criminal who'd agreed to testify against his former associates in exchange for immunity." The lie was so smooth, so confident, that Eve almost believed it herself. But she could see the cost it was taking on Briggs, the weight of yet another deception, another burden to carry for the rest of his life. "I see," Blackwood said, making notes in a leather-bound journal. "And the destruction of the saloon, collateral damage from the firefight," Briggs replied. "Regrettable but unavoidable under the circumstances." Judge Blackwood closed his journal with a snap that sounded like a gunshot in the relative quiet following the storm's passage. "Very well, Agent Briggs. I'll need you to accompany me back to the territorial capital for a full debriefing. As for Miss Larue and Mr. Ashford, you're free to go." with the court's gratitude for your cooperation in this matter. As the judge and Briggs prepared to leave, collecting what evidence they could from the scene, Eve found herself alone with Kane among the graves of Deadwood Crossing's dead. The storm was finally passing, leaving behind a landscape scoured clean by wind and rain. "Why did he do it?" she asked quietly. "Why did Briggs lie for us?" Kane was quiet for a long moment, studying the bodies of men he'd once called friends. "Guilt," he said finally. "Same thing that brought me here tonight. Some debts can only be paid in blood, but others require something more. They require sacrifice. What happens to us now?" Kane's smile was tired but genuine. "Now we disappear? Find some place where nobody knows our names or our stories. Start over with clean slates and clear consciences. Is that possible after everything we've done? I don't know," Kane admitted. "But I figure it's worth trying. Your father believed in second chances, didn't he? Maybe it's time we gave his philosophy a test." They left Deadwood Crossing that very night, riding north under stars that were finally visible after the storm's passage. Behind them, the burned remains of the Larue Saloon stood as a monument to the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The journey to Colorado territory took them through country that grew greener and more forgiving with each passing mile. They traveled as brother and sister, two survivors of frontier violence seeking a fresh start in a land that promised redemption to those brave enough to claim it. Kane had salvaged enough money from Durant's corpse to buy a small farm in a valley where a clear stream ran year-round, and the soil was rich enough to grow anything a person might need. They built a simple house with their own hands, working side by side through the long summer days as their bodies healed and their nightmares gradually faded. Eve planted a garden using seeds she'd saved from her mother's flowers, creating something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. Kane learned to work with his hands in ways that built rather than destroyed, discovering that there was satisfaction in creating something that would outlast his own brief time on Earth. They were married the following spring in a simple ceremony attended by their new neighbors, people who knew them as hard-working farmers rather than survivors of violence. Eve wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved through years of hardship, while Kane wore a new suit and the first genuine smile he'd worn in 23 years. Their first child was born 2 years later, a daughter they named Sarah after Kane's mother. Holding his baby girl for the first time, Kane wept openly, marveling at the miracle of new life emerging from so much death and destruction. But the past never fully released its hold on them. One autumn evening, as they sat on their front porch watching their daughter play in the yard with a rag doll Eve had sewn for her, a stranger rode up to their gate. He was young, maybe 25, with the lean build and steady eyes that marked him as someone familiar with violence. "Are you Jonah Ashford?" the stranger asked, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Kane's own hand moved instinctively toward where his gun belt used to hang, finding only empty air. He'd buried his weapons years ago along with the man he used to be. "Who's asking?" "Name's Billy Santos. My daddy was Miguel Santos, worked as a guard at the Silver Creek mining camp. You probably don't remember him." Kane's face went white as bleached bone. "I remember." "Good," Billy said, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace. "Then you know why I'm here." Eve felt her blood turn to ice. After all these years of peace, after everything they'd built together, the past had finally caught up with them. She moved to put herself between the stranger and their daughter, her mind racing through possibilities and escape routes. "Billy, man," Kane said quietly, "your father was a good man. He tried to stop what happened that night." "I know," Billy replied. "My mama told me the story before she died. How he drew on Clay Durant to protect the women and children. How Durant shot him down like a dog in the street." Kane's shoulders sagged with the weight of old guilt. "I should have stopped it. Should have stood with your father instead of watching him die." "Yes," Billy agreed. "You should have, but you didn't. Question is, What are you going to do about it now? The moment stretched between them like a taut wire full of potential violence and years of accumulated pain. Eve held her breath, waiting for the sound of gunshots for the past to finally claim its due in blood. Instead, Billy Santos did something unexpected. He smiled. My mama also told me about the letter you sent her after Silver Creek. He continued. The one with $500 in it and a promise that my daddy's death wouldn't be forgotten. She used that money to move to San Francisco to give me and my sisters a chance at a better life. Kane's eyes widened with surprise. You got the letter, every word of it, along with the money you sent every year until I turned 18. Anonymous donations from someone who called himself a friend of Miguel Santos. Mama always knew it was you. Eve stared at her husband in amazement. In all their years together, Kane had never mentioned sending money to the families of Silver Creek's victims. It was just one more burden he'd carried in silence, one more way he'd tried to atone for sins that could never be fully forgiven. What do you want from me? Kane asked. Billy's smile widened. I want to shake your hand and thank you. For the money for the letters, but mostly for what you did to Clay Durant and his crew. It took 23 years, but justice finally caught up with them. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Kane took it. They stood there in the golden evening light, two men bound by tragedy and the hope of redemption, while Eve watched with tears streaming down her face. There's something else, Billy continued. I'm a deputy marshal now working out of Denver. Been tracking down the last few members of Durant's organization, the ones who weren't at Deadwood Crossing that night. Found something you might be interested in. He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio, its contents protected by oiled cloth. Charlie Briggs asked me to give you this before he died. Consumption took him last winter, but he held on long enough to finish his work. Kane opened the portfolio with trembling hands, revealing page after page of meticulous records. Names, dates, locations, amounts stolen. It was a complete accounting of every crime Durant's gang had committed over 20 years, along with detailed information about their victims and survivors. He spent his last years tracking down every family, every widow, every orphaned child. Billy explained. Made sure they got compensation from the gang's hidden assets. Your wife's family received $5,000, Mr. Ashford. Charlie wanted you to know that your boy's death wasn't forgotten either. Kane's composure finally cracked completely. He sank to his knees on the porch steps, the portfolio falling from nerveless fingers as 23 years of guilt and grief poured out of him in great, racking sobs. Eve knelt beside him, holding him while he wept for his lost family, for Miguel Santos, for all the victims of Silver Creek and the terrible choices that had defined his life. Their daughter Sarah, too young to understand the significance of what was happening, but old enough to recognize her father's pain, toddled over and wrapped her small arms around Kane's neck. Don't cry, Papa, she whispered. I love you. Billy Santos mounted his horse and prepared to leave, his mission completed. Charlie wanted you to know something else, he called back. He said to tell you that redemption isn't about undoing the past. It's about choosing to build something better from the ashes of what was destroyed. He rode away into the gathering dusk, leaving the small family alone with their hard-won peace and the knowledge that sometimes justice comes not from the end of a gun, but from the quiet choices made by imperfect people trying to do better. That night, as they tucked Sarah into her bed, Eve noticed that Kane had placed her father's photograph on the mantel beside a new addition, a small portrait of Miguel Santos that Billy had left behind. The two men, one an engineer and dreamer, the other a guard who died trying to protect innocents, seemed to watch over their home with the benevolent presence of guardian spirits. Do you think we'll ever be truly free of it? Eve asked the same question she'd posed years earlier. Kane considered her words seriously, as he always did. I used to think freedom meant forgetting the past, pretending it never happened. But I think I was wrong. Real freedom comes from remembering the past without letting it define your future. From carrying the weight of your choices without letting them crush you. He pulled her close, and they stood together in the lamplight, listening to their daughter's peaceful breathing. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwood trees they'd planted their first spring, carrying with it the promise of seasons yet to come. The ghosts of Silver Creek would never fully rest. Some wounds were too deep, some losses too profound for complete healing. But they no longer had the power to destroy. The debts had been paid as fully as mortal accounts allowed, the scales balanced, as well as imperfect justice could manage. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered: the love of a good woman, the laughter of a healthy child, the satisfaction of honest work, and the knowledge that when the final accounting came, they had chosen to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. The frontier was indeed being tamed, but not by men like Clay Durant, who sought to impose their will through violence and fear. It was being tamed by ordinary people like Thomas Larue and Miguel Santos, like Eve and Cain and their daughter Sarah, people who chose hope over hatred, forgiveness over vengeance, and the difficult work of building civilization from the ground up. As the years passed, their farm prospered and their family grew. They had 2 more children, a son they named Thomas after Eve's father, and another daughter called Maria in honor of Miguel Santos's memory. The children grew up knowing the truth about their parents' past, understanding that even good people sometimes had to make terrible choices in order to survive and protect what mattered most. Cain never picked up a gun again, though he kept one hidden in the house in case the past came calling in a less friendly form than Billy Santos. Eve ran a small school for the local children, teaching them to read and write and think for themselves, skills that would serve them well in the changing world that was coming to the American frontier. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind was high and the coyotes sang their lonely songs, they would sit on their porch and remember. They remembered Thomas Larue and his dreams of a civilized frontier. They remembered Miguel Santos and his courage in the face of overwhelming evil. They remembered Charlie Briggs and his final act of redemption. Most of all, they remembered the lesson that had taken them so long to learn, that the measure of a person's life wasn't found in their worst moments, but in what they chose to do with the time that remained after those moments had passed. The past was prologue. Nothing more. The story that truly mattered was the one they were writing together, word by word, day by day, in the rich soil of a Colorado valley, where clear water ran year-round, and children could grow up believing that tomorrow would be better than today. That was their victory over Clay Durant and everything he represented. Not the gunfight in a storm-lashed cemetery, not the bodies left behind in the dust of Deadwood Crossing, but this, a simple life lived well, a family raised with love, a small corner of the world made better by their presence. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.